Hey guys, it's Josh from Depth Channel, and today we're going to be talking about what is the worst diesel engine ever made. Now, anyone that's worked on diesel engines probably has a candidate that they would like to say what it is, and I've made the What's the Worst Cat Diesel Engine Ever Made video, where I said the C7S is, in my opinion, the worst diesel engine ever made, and a lot of people seem to think it was the 3208 though. Now, there's a buddy of mine named Dale who likes to write me quite often, and we were having a discussion about the 3116, which is a cat engine, and while not the best cat engine ever made, he made the claim that there's an engine out there that's way worse. And I'd never heard of this engine before, and that's because it's a Detroit engine, and it hasn't been made in quite a long time. And that engine is the Detroit Fuel Pincher 8.2 V8 diesel engine. Now, he wrote a very long letter to me explaining why it was such a horrible engine. And I gotta tell you folks, I know that Dale is not someone to deceive people, but I was shocked with how bad he described this engine as. And having read his letter twice, I then said, oh, I gotta verify what he's saying here is correct. And sure as heck, the more you dig into this engine, the worse it gets. So first thing I like to do is read most of his letter as to what, as a Detroit tech in the industry in the 80s, he was working on these daily. Now, the Detroit 8.2 is a V8 four-stroke Detroit, and it was made starting production in 1979 and ended in the around 93, 94. And from what I can read, it was a horrible engine, folks. So let's read most of Dale's letter, and then what we'll do is kind of do a little more discussion about the engine. And you know, in the comment section, why don't you say what you think the worst diesel engine ever made is? And maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but I thought you would find it interesting. So Dale's letter here is, let's talk about the DD 8.2 V8. It's 500 cubic inch engine, four-stroke. And remember, most Detroits at this time were two-stroke, not four-stroke. So this was a departure for Detroit diesel. And they came out in the fall of 1979 and verified that as correct. And for the 1980 model year. Now these engines, the base, now this is a 500 cubic inch engine, folks, made 130 horsepower. Most motorcycles now make more than that. This was a 500 cubic inch diesel engine. Now it was naturally aspirated and there was a turbocharger option used mostly on highway, but a little bit of off-highway as well. But from what I could tell, mostly it was marine applications, which I'd hate to be in a boat with this engine, folks. First off, the 8.2 naturally aspirated, as it was seen, I saw it, was in a Ford F700. Got the job because I was the only one who had metric tools. So that's funny. This may be the first metric fastenered Detroit engine. It was towed in, and after looking over, determined the oil cooler had shifted over 1.5 inches due to something inside the engine pushing it over, meaning an internal failure. Called the factory and was told not to disassemble it. Told to pull the engine, put a new one in, send the old one back to the factory for failure analysis. So it sounds like he was really early in on these. So I did all that, got truck back to the customer. The next spring was when the 8.2s were really out in big numbers. The first big problem was the CDR and the turbochargers caused runaway engines, and you had to put open breathers on. So apparently they had a closed crankcase ventilation system I'm assuming that's what they had here. Now folks, while doing the research on this engine, it turns out almost every engine produced in this time frame was replaced under warranty. Not just fixed, but replaced under warranty. So about half of the engines made were replacements for the first half of the engines made. So not that good of an engine. So middle of that, when it started, the head gaskets leaking coolant to the outside of the block, and that's when we found it was an open deck block, and if the deck was out of specification or damaged, had to get a new block. Also, we had to drill out through the firewall and floor into the cab on the back two cylinders to get the push rods out on the GM trucks. Can you believe that sentence, folks? Read that again. So we had to drill holes through the firewall and the floor into the cab on the back two cylinders to get the push rods out on the GM trucks. Now, GM is over Detroit at this time. So they were putting engines that basically their parent company made for their trucks in their trucks, but there was no room to disassemble them to get the push rods out, so they had to drill holes through the trucks themselves. And one thing I thought was interesting, which I've never really looked into, was, and he had said this in the previous sentence, it is what they call an open deck block. And I thought to myself, what is an open deck block? I haven't really heard of that before. So basically, instead of the block just being a flat plane with a couple coolant passages, head bolt holes, and the cylinder bores, the cylinders themselves are not encased on the top with cast iron. They're just open. So of course the head gasket's really the only solid piece between the head and the deck in that situation of the block. So yeah, you getting some coolant leaks? I bet you were. I don't know why on earth they would have tried this. People don't like the 32/8s, but they did not have this bad design. Okay, so we were going along changing head gaskets in the middle of that, got a new updated head gasket, and instructions to drill a cooling passage in the head. Well, we were barely ahead, keeping our heads above water, replacing the head gaskets and blocks, when yet another head gasket update was released. Now we were to replace the 14 millimeter head bolts with 15 millimeter head bolts and torque turn them. To do this, we had to use special tooling to ream the bolt holes and then thread them in chassis. Also ream the heads for the bigger bolts was going along reasonably well until we found out that the torque turn method was tweaking some blocks enough that the cam bearing would seize to the cam. Back apart again and replace the block. Then after we finally got ahead of those problems, we started seeing engines using excessive oil. Turned out the factory admitted that some of the blocks had cylinders that were too hard. How do you have a too hard of a cylinder? Or engine block in this case, because these are parent board. These don't have liners, folks, so you can't easily replace them. Similar to 3208, you can't replace the liner. You have to replace the block like most automotive engines. As the engine started to age, we learned aluminum fuel transfer pumps are junk, replaced with a cast iron pump, cam follower failures, oil pump bushing spinning in the block, which required the block to be replaced. The coppers, those are the injector cups. A lot of people call them coppers because they used to be copper. Mostly they are steel though now. Not holding compression seal, coppers cracking, coolant in the fuel in the coolant, valve stem pitting, rocker arm pitting, thrust main flaking, excessive thrust, fuel manifold restriction port drilled wrong side, air compressor bracket breaking, that finally got updated. Oil pan designed to leak, that's funny. Finally updated, 2 different water pumps, 2 different regulators, can't mix them up, attempt at an electronic governor control, that must have been a nightmare. So what he's talking about there is obviously they were mechanical engines and then they had some sort of retrofit to the electronic or added electronics to try to make them, I guess, more efficient or more reliable over the zero reliability they had. And they had to convert it back to mechanical. So they went from mechanical to electronic back to mechanical. And after all that, probably some I forgot was happening, just not to us. They still continue to fail. Someone somewhere in the GM system finally figured out the engine was simply no good and stopped production in 1990. They continued to offer remans till 93, but the reman engines were reman junk engines, built out of the reman junk parts. Remaining only made it worse. Many failing right after installation. That is so sad. So may I say remember what I said, we were talking about the Cat 3116 is a great engine when compared to the DD 8.2. The 8.2 is so bad, I would not trust it to use as a boat anchor or to melt it down to make a manhole cover for the sewer department. So then his final sentence final paragraph is pretty funny. The one and only thing it did well was it is advertised as the fuel pincher. And when they did ran right, they did make good mile per gallon, but all the fuel savings went to repairs to keep it on the road, to make more good mileage, to pay for even more repairs to keep it on the road. I would advise you that if one should ever show up at your door, nicely say, I can't help you, even if I wanted to. Bye. Thank you, Dale, for that letter. And wow. So reading that letter, yeah, I was surprised. There's no way that an engine actually made it, and made it for a fairly long production run, pretty much the whole decade of the 80s, without being pulled. But everything said in here, folks, I could validate from other websites. Now, like I said, I've never worked on this engine, folks. It doesn't sound like there's hardly any of these engines out there still. There's probably a couple. It seems like any ones that are out there still are probably in boats. Probably any trucks that have these have been replaced with something else. Sounds like pretty much any engine would have been better off than this one. And really sad. I'm sure, you got to remember, folks, these engines, they don't just pop out of nowhere. I'm sure a team of engineers stayed up late at night working on this engine, trying to make it work. Fixes, smart engineers, smart mechanics trying to get this to work. People, I'm sure, lost their jobs, lost lots of money with these designed engines, but from what I can tell, folks, this is, without a doubt, the worst engine design I've ever heard of. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the DD 8.2 is the worst diesel engine ever made. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have another candidate that you think is probably worse off than this one, I'd like to hear about it in the comments section. And as always, thanks for watching.